or to the cloud. Okay. Right. So we're recording also for Sharon. Okay. So yes, tomorrow's Tanis Esther. Tomorrow we fast. And then tomorrow night, please God, we begin by reading the Megillah. And we're going to also read the Megillah on Friday. And we have a Seudah, we have a meal on Friday where we wash for bread. And when we bench, after we've had our meal, we're going to add in a special part for Purim, which we only get the opportunity to do once a year. So it's important to have that meal on Friday. That's or we could do it on Thursday night. It's a very, very important day to buy. And if a person asks for tzedakah, specifically a Jewish person, then we're not permitted to decline. So even if we have 10 Rand handy or whatever, you know, Chevra Kadisha posts all over the place, which is so nice because they make it easy for us to fulfill this mitzvah. And then we also must give, we swap shalach. Most people say 2 foods in, 2 different brachas. Some people say you only have to even have 1 bracha in. So, so those are the different minhagim of the day. And okay, and now I want to try and share some insights about, and hopefully these are insights that have never been heard before, because the story of Purim we all know, and we understand that Hashem's hand is really hidden behind the scenes. And I read a letter by the Lubavitcher Rebbe where he says that, and he compares Purim and Pesach, and how even though at the time of Purim, it seemed that there was a natural sequence of events which happened, we must know that Hashem was orchestrating behind the scenes throughout the whole time. And then we also need to know that at the time of Pesach, in Pesach time, where nevertheless we see open miracles, both of them are the hand of God. Both of them, Hashem is orchestrating every single detail, whether it's clearly the hand of God through open miracles like the time of Pesach, or where Hashem is more concealed, as in the time of Purim. So that's something to think about as we approach this time. Now, some of you may know the background before we open the Megillah, which begins with the story of Purim and an enormous party that's been thrown by King Achashverosh. Let's look a little bit at the background. And it's very interesting because what I'm about to share, a lot of it seems like a legend, common legend. And we see that actually practically every story that exists in the world out there is actually sourced in the Torah. We've done Shiurim in the past. We could probably do it again if there's a request of how mermaids and the idea of mermaids and centaurs is also sourced in the Torah. Rashi speaks of a seren, which is a mermaid. And we've seen that things like the Bermuda Triangle, we find sources for that in the Torah. And so now let's have a look at the story behind the story of Purim. So at the time, or in ancient days, after Nebuchadnezzar had exiled many of the Yidden, much of Bnei Israel, to Babel, to Babylon. And Babylonia was the empire that was the mightiest in those times. The son of Nebuchadnezzar was the next king who took over after him, and his name was Belshazzar. But they were not the ruling empires of the day. There was the Median Empire and there was the Persian Empire. Now, the story goes that, and there are different opinions about it, but it is sourced in the Torah, that the daughter of the king of Persia went and she had an illicit affair, an illicit romance with a commoner. And then she fell pregnant. And then her daughter, this daughter ended up having a baby boy. And the king of Persia was very, very humiliated by the fact that she had gone and had an illicit through this. And so this child, this baby boy, he left on a mountain. And he left this baby on a mountain in order that he should die. However, we are told that a dog came along and suckled, and this child suckled on the dog. The terrible condition which it had when it had grown a little bit, and brought this child up. And in fact, the thieves knew the story, and they told this child, your mother is a princess in Persia, and your grandfather is the king of Persia. And so the throne is rightfully yours. And so the story goes that this boy, whose name was Koresh, or better known to most as Cyrus, this boy grew up and he went and he killed his grandfather, the king of Persia, and then he became the next king of Persia. So the king Cyrus of Persia, known as Cyrus the Great, these were his humble beginnings. And we're going to refer to him, as the Torah does, as Koresh. At the same time, the Median king was known as Daryavesh, or Darius. And he contacted Koresh and said to him, look, the king of Bavel has now got the mightiest kingdom, or the mightiest, let's say kingdom throughout the ancient world. Let's make an alliance, and together we can overthrow the king of Bavel, the Babylonian king. And so how did they make alliances in those days? The families would marry into one another. And so we learn that the daughter of Daryavesh, who was from the Median Empire, married Koresh, this Cyrus, who was now the king of the Persian Empire. And so they joined forces. And their plan was to go and attack the Babylonian king and his entire household, and therefore become the mightiest empire in the ancient world. And at this time, Belshazzar, who was the king of the Babylonians, the mightiest empire of the time, had calculated that since the time that his father never had destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, first Beis Hamikdash, and at the time when Bnei Israel was sent into exile. And he said that they would be in exile for a period of 70 years, but after 70 years, a new Beis Hamikdash would be built, that the second Beis Hamikdash would indeed be built, and that Bnei Israel would return to Eretz Israel. And so King Belshazzar is watching carefully. And according to his calculations, which obviously he had miscalculated, a 70-year period had passed, and there's no second Beis Hamikdash. And so he threw a party in order to celebrate that he is still the empire of the day, and that he still is ruling the Jewish people, and that they have not returned to their land. And at Belshazzar's party, he took out many of the different vessels that his father had plundered from the first Beis Hamikdash, and he displayed them to show we are the mightiest. And all of a sudden, at this party, the most strange phenomenon happened. And what was it? As many people say, the writing was on the wall. So even that saying, it seems that its origins are found in the Torah. What does that mean? It means that all of a sudden, a hand appeared and scribbled writing on the wall. It was the most, let's say, spiritual and frightening occurrence. And in fact, the words that were written on the wall were Aramaic words. And it's recorded in the Torah as follows. The Aramaic writing that appeared on the wall was Mane Mane, Takel, Ufarsin. And nobody understood what it meant. So King Belshazzar called the prophet Daniel, who had been exiled with his people to Babel, to Babylonia. And they understood that this is an incredibly holy man. And they called him to come and decipher the strange writing on the wall. And he said, "You have been weighed and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and will be given to the Persians." Now, obviously, King Belshazzar was terrified by this prophecy and what had been written on the wall. But that very night, he was assassinated by King Koresh, and his entire household was killed, except for one little girl, the daughter of Belshazzar, whose name was Vashti. They had mercy upon her, and they allowed her to live. And therefore, who took over the Persian Empire? It was the son of Koresh and the daughter of Darius, whom he married. And this son's name was Ahasuerus, king of Persia. And when he grew up, he married this young princess who had been the daughter of the Babylonian king, Vashti. And so she now became the queen of Persia. Very interestingly, she always looked down on her husband because she believed that her father was the rightful king of the ancient world. Her father who had been murdered by the Persians. So this is a little bit of context before we step into the story of Purim. It's absolutely fascinating. And we see the origins of Ahasuerus and the origins of his wife Vashti, and why she always looked down upon her husband as not being of, especially because his father was brought up by dogs. Okay, so let's move on now and let's delve into the story. And we're not going to go through the whole story, but I found beautiful Kabbalistic insights that show how everything in our history is all connected. Nothing stands in isolation, including this story of Purim. So when we step into the story of Purim, again by the king of Persia, King Ahasuerus, and he's throwing the party for three reasons. One, because he wants to show the world that he has married this beautiful princess, and she really is from royal blood, and her name is Vashti. So he's celebrating his wife. He's also celebrating the fact that he feels that his kingdom is established, and he was ruling on over 127 provinces throughout the ancient world. So he was an incredibly powerful man. And finally, he too had done a calculation from the time that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and in his according to his calculations, in his mind, 70 years have also passed since the first Beis HaMikdash has been destroyed, and there is no second Beis HaMikdash, and therefore the prophecy is not going to actually come to fruition. And he too took out the vessels from the Beis HaMikdash that have obviously been stolen from the Babylonians, and he's parading them around, showing that ultimately he has triumphed. Now, we're going to come back to the party, but one of the things that's brought out by an incredibly holy Kabbalist, an 18th century Kabbalist known as the Chida, His name was Rav Chaim Yosef David Azulai. And if any of you remember that name Azulai, he had a great-great-great-great-grandfather from 200 years earlier, whose name was Rav Avraham Azulai. That famous man, yes, Adele, who went down into the cave in Hebron, and he met Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So this person, the Chida, is the descendant of Rav Avraham Azulai. And he's also an extremely holy man. And at the end of our shiur, please God, I'll share an incredible story about him that illustrates who he really was. Now, he wrote many, many books. I think he wrote about 71 books, and he traveled all over the world. His origins were in Jerusalem in Eretz Israel, but he traveled around because in Eretz Israel, they liked to have a representative who would go to Chutz La'aretz, outside of the land, and keep connections between the Jews outside of Eretz Israel with those in Eretz Israel, and sometimes to raise funds and just to keep that strong connection. And so he traveled around extensively, and his final days were in Italy, where he finally settled and where he was buried. My understanding is that his remains, however, were at a later stage brought to be buried in Eretz Israel. And the Chida tells us as follows. That, let's see how that's relevant in the story of Purim. So first of all, we know he also tells us that Haman is a reincarnation, a Gilgul of Esav, the brother of Yaakov. How is it relevant, though, in the story? So we know that in Sefer Bereshis, in the book of Bereshis, Yaakov had fled to Haran, to his father-in-law, and, well, he fled to his family, his mother's family, and there he married 2 daughters, and eventually he leaves his father-in-law, and he takes his wives and his children and his livestock, and he's going back home, back to his father Yitzchak. And when he comes on his way back home, he knows that Esav is still mad at him. Esav was angry at him, and Esav wanted to kill him for stealing the blessings that his father Yitzchak bestowed upon him. And as he approaches Esav and Esav's entire army, he has made a plan. And he sent him gifts, and he split up his family into several camps. But when he actually saw Esav, it says in Sefer Bereshis that Yaakov bowed 7 times. And that seems to be a sin, because we are not permitted to bow to anyone or anything other than the Almighty. So how is it that the holiest of the patriarchs, Yaakov Avinu, is actually bowing down to Esav? And it's brought out that, in fact, Hashem's Shekhinah had appeared, God's divine presence had appeared before him to welcome him back to Eretz Israel. And it was to Hashem's Shekhinah that he was bowing, not to his brother Esav. However, the perception of those around him, his wives and his children and anybody else who had accompanied him, was that he was bowing to his brother Esav. And for this, he had to make a rectification. So why are we reincarnated? And a spark of our original soul, or the soul of somebody from a lifetime before, is now implanted in a new lifetime in order to do a tikkun, in order to do a rectification. And so we see that if Yaakov is reincarnated as Mordechai and Esav as Haman, how did Mordechai make a rectification for Yaakov's actions? He refused to bow down to Haman. He refused. Yes, okay, you see it. And Haman was always seething about this. In fact, it says in the Megillah, Haman had everything. He had power. He had prestige in the king's court. He had a fortune of money. He had a wife. He had 10 sons and a daughter. He had everything. He had also got King Ahasuerus to agree to his plan to eliminate the Jewish people. But every time that Mordecai refused to bow down to him, Haman was incensed, and he could not have any inner peace because of it. And clearly it's because there is a soul situation taking place here as well. Now, let's continue and carry on a little bit further. And let's continue with this idea of reincarnations, because the Chidah brings out further something else. So let's bring this teaching from the Chidah. He says that the Midrash states that Hadassah is Esther. So Hadassah is another name for Esther. Esther means concealed, hidden, from the word histir, and that's because God's hand was hidden throughout the story of Purim. And Hadassah is a myrtle tree. So we learn that the myrtle tree, or a branch from the myrtle tree, has a beautiful scent, but it's bitter to taste. And so it says in the Midrash that Esther was sweet for Mordecai and bitter for Haman. And let's thrash that out and bring it out a little bit more. The Chidah says as follows: Esther was a reincarnation of Eve, of Chava, from the times, the beginning of time in Gan Eden. And Haman was a reincarnation of the Nachash, the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Very, very interesting. And he says, according to the teachings of the Arizal, Mordechai is a reincarnation of Yaakov. But who is Yaakov a reincarnation of? Yaakov is a reincarnation of Adam. That's a well-known idea in the Torah. Okay, so let's look at it. We understand that when Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, all her senses were involved in the sin except for one. And we've learned this before. The sense of smell was not involved in the sin of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And therefore, the sense of smell, scent, never became blemished in the way that all the other senses became blemished at the time of this sin in Gan Eden. And therefore, scent affects one's neshama, affects one's soul very deeply, differently from the other senses. The other senses are more physical, but sense is more of a spiritual experience. Further, we learn that Mordechai is associated with the words from the Targum Onkelos, which translates, it's a translation of the Chumash into Aramaic, and it seems that Mordechai is referred to, connected with one of the 11 spices that was used for the ketores. Yes, and so he's referred to as Mordechai. Mor is myrrh. Dechaya is from a wild animal. But Mordechai is known as the perfect or the pure myrrh, Mordechai. So he's also associated with sense. And therefore, with scent, and therefore we see that if Esther is called Hadassah, she's associated with a beautiful scent, and Mordechai, who is associated with the myrrh, pure myrrh, he's also associated with a beautiful scent. So we see that Esther is sweet for Mordechai, because of the salvation she brought to Bnei Israel, and because she is a sweet scent. But for Haman, she was bitter. Why? Because Haman is associated with, or he is the reincarnation of the serpent, the Nachash, in the Garden of Eden. And therefore, in destroying Haman in the story of Purim, or at the time of Purim, she's doing a rectification, because it was the serpent that brought her to sin as Chava in the first place. And so she is a reincarnation of Eve. Haman is a reincarnation of the serpent. And the serpent was the one who brought her to sin. And therefore, now, at the time of Purim, through her righteousness and through bringing about the downfall of Haman, she brings about a rectification for the sin that the Nachash brought her to do in the Garden of Eden. And we see it further because it says that the Hadass, this myrtle tree, is bitter to taste. What did the Nachash do? What did the serpent do? He made her taste from the tree of knowledge. And so ultimately, when she becomes bitter for Haman, when Esther is bitter for Haman, that is because she's doing a rectification for what he brought her to do in ancient times, at the very beginning of creation in Gan Eden. So this is a beautiful insight that brings out so much in terms of the story of Purim, something that most people don't know. When we see the Gilgulim, the reincarnations of the different characters, and how everything is ultimately connected. And of course, she's sweet for Mordechai because she's also rectifying that which Adam got involved in at the beginning of time through the sin of taking from the tree of knowledge. Now, just to bring out something else, which I thought was very interesting, we learn about Esther that at the time where she was called upon to approach King Ahasuerus in order to bring salvation to the people to the Bnei Israel, to the Jewish people, she had to have the greatest Mesiras Nefesh. She had to have the greatest self-sacrifice. This woman gave up everything. And let's understand this. I heard from Hannah Weisberg. She was explaining the story of Purim, and she explained as follows, that Esther was taken to the palace to be looked at by King Ahasuerus as a potential wife, completely against her will. Now, most of the commentaries tell us that she was in fact the cousin of Mordechai, and she was an orphan, and therefore he brought her up. And then they married. And so she was the wife of Mordechai. Now, she kept every mitzvah while she was the queen in the palace of Ahasuerus. It was very difficult, but she only ate seeds and fruits and vegetables in order not to eat any tray food. And she also requested 7 maidens when she was in the harem waiting for the king to call her to see if he wanted to choose her as queen. And obviously, she kept those handmaids. Why did she choose 7? Because she gave each one the name of a different day of the week, so that even if she was cut off from the Jewish people and she was in the palace, she could know which day would be Shabbat, so that she could observe Shabbat. But we are told further, most of the commentaries tell us, that she also managed to keep mikvah. And so she could still be intimate with her husband, Mordechai, obviously in secret. But the tragedy is that whenever the king called her as his queen, she had to be intimate with the king. But it was completely against her will. It was completely considered as though he forced himself on her. And if you look at the situation, she had absolutely no choice. And therefore, because it was not consensual, she was not considered an adulteress, and she could still be with her husband, Mordechai. And it seemed like such a tragic situation, but at least she had the comfort of being with her husband, whom she loved. However, At the time when Mordecai found out that the Jewish people are under threat and that the entire Jewish people is being threatened with annihilation, every single man, woman, and child throughout the Persian Empire, he turned to Esther and said, "It is the strangest thing that you have been chosen as queen out of all the women in the Persian Empire. And perhaps it is for this purpose alone that you have been put into this position, for the purposes of saving the Jewish nation." And therefore he said, "Now you must go and approach the king." And she said, "He has not called on me in over 30 days. He has not called for me. And it is forbidden to go to the king if you are not summoned first." And he said, and Mordecai said, "Nevertheless, you should go." And he gave her the choice. He said, "If you choose not to, then the salvation of Bnei Israel will come through the hand of someone else. But it seems that God put you in this position specifically in order to bring about the salvation of your people." And so she chose to go to the king. And she uses two words very interestingly. And she says, "Im avadati avadati." If I perish, then I perish. But Hannah Weisberg brought out so beautifully, and obviously this comes from the Mefarshim, from the commentaries, that the reason she says those words twice is because now she has to go to the king of her own accord. And therefore, she's voluntarily going to be with him. And therefore, according to Jewish law, after that, she's no longer permitted to her husband. It's tragic. And what she is saying is, I'm giving up two things, not only potentially my life, but also my marriage with my husband. And so you see, this must have been the hardest thing for her to do. And therefore, she had the greatest self-sacrifice that I think any woman could be called on to have. But if we see that she's doing a repair for Chava, for Eve in Gan Eden, then there's more of a global picture here. And we see that this is not only going to benefit Bnei Israel, but surely it's going to benefit her neshama also. And ultimately, everything is for the good. So Queen Esther lived in the castle or in the palace with King Ahasuerus, and he lived for another 10 years after the story of Purim. And they actually had a child, and they called this child Daryavesh. And Daryavesh was a good king, and he allowed Bnei Israel to go back to Eretz Israel and to build the second Beis Hamikdash. Okay, now let's have a look. Let's delve into something else that I found that I thought was very interesting, connected with the story of Purim. And that is the idea of wine. Because when we enter into the story of Purim, the book opens and we are told that this was a very, very lavish party that Ahasuerus was throwing. He for the men, Vashti a party at the same time for the women. And it says that there was royal wine served in abundance. And in fact, the word that's used for the party is mishte. Now, the Mefarshim tell us that this loosely translates as a drinking party. So the abundance of the party in Shushan at this time was really this incredible wine, the royal wine that was being served. And we are told that what made it so abundant, what made it this wine so valuable and such a treasure that was shared. And it says in the Megillah, the Talmud, the sages of the Talmud comment on the Megillah and say that each guest drank wine whose vintage was older than their own age. Very interesting. And the Maharal of Prague comes along and teaches us many deep insights from this idea. And he says as follows, that first of all, we see that of all physicality in the world, mostly every physical thing begins to decay. Physicality deteriorates. That's the nature of physicality in this world versus spirituality. Except for one thing, it seems. Except for wine. Wine only improves with age. Wine only gets better with the passing of time. So that's very, very interesting. And he brings out that wine has a connection with a person's thoughts, because he shows us that so too our thoughts improve with age, with time. So if you think about it, we start off as little children and we have certain thoughts, and then as we mature, we become teenagers, and then, please God, adults. And through our adult years, we should grow in wisdom, and we should grow in the way that we think, and our thoughts should become improved with age, with time. And therefore, we see the connection that the Maharal brings out between thoughts and wine. And he says this actually gives us a clue, an insight into Hashem's intention for the world at the beginning of time. So we see we're connecting time again, and we're going back. And the Maharal brings out that Hashem's intention was the entire world have had this particular let's say, this particular condition, sorry, for want of a better word, that with time we were supposed to improve. But with the sin, with the eating of the tree of knowledge in Gan Eden, this changed. And now what happened was physicality deteriorates and man became mortal. But we see that what has the Maharal said continues and improves thoughts, the intellect. And that did not get negatively affected by the sin of the tree of knowledge. And so what's interesting is that thought is associated with spirituality. It's not something physical. It's of the realm of the spiritual. And so therefore, our thoughts, our intellect continues like wine, continues to improve with time. And it has not been negatively affected by the sin of the tree of knowledge. Now, the Maharal brings out a deeper lesson with this. And he says, there's a teaching in the Torah, Nichnas yayin yotzei sod. When wine goes in, the secrets come out. And he shows the gematria of the two are the same. So if you take the word yayin, which is wine, the gematria, the numerical value is 70. And if you take the word for soid, secret, the numerical value is also 70. And he said, wine comes from a concealed place. And it's associated with secrets. So according to the way or the approach of the Maharal, who often uses numeracy in his learning and his teachings, he says that if we bring the number 10, or if we bring multiples of 10 to a number, it doesn't change the essence of the number. So if we're working with 70, we can actually go to 7, and we can look at the number 7. And so he's going to bring out a teaching with this. And he says, let's begin with the number 6, because it seems that in the three-dimensional physical world, everything has 6 sides, as in the sides of a cube. So the number 6 relates to the 6 sides of physical existence. What's 7? Number 7 is the point at the center of the cube. Number 7 is the unity, or the essence point within physicality. And this point represents the inner essence of all of existence. So he's saying as follows. He's saying wine points to that which is hidden. And wine is associated with number 7. Now, if you look at all the significant times that we have as Bnei Israel, whether it's Shabbat, or it's one of the Chagim, one of the festivals, or it's a Simcha, we always bring wine. Wine is fundamental to all of those significant milestones for the Jewish people. And what's the point? The point is not to get drunk and lose ourselves completely to the wine. The point of the wine is to have that awareness and use our thoughts to know that ultimately, in this time of significance, we're supposed to focus on the essence point, the unity. And that is our mission, which we've spoken about again and again. We are supposed to look and remember that we're supposed to bring out the hidden potential in this physical world, the hidden spirituality and the godliness that exists, the kedusha that exists in the physical. And so every time that we have wine at one of these significant, important times, we need to remember what is the ultimate goal. At the time of Purim, they were celebrating, and the objective was debauchery and excess and having wine in order to just completely lose oneself and get drunk. But for us, it's different. For us, we need to keep in mind that we're supposed to drink on Purim, and we have to have that goal in mind, that the wine is there in order to help us focus on the essence point, on the ultimate goal of our joy on Purim. And that is bringing out that which was concealed, and the hand of God was concealed at that time. So we can look at our lives and say, we're not necessarily going to have these big Purim parties this year. We can't necessarily socialize and feast together as we have in years gone by. And it seems very, very sad. And it may seem like, where is God in all this suffering that's happening? Where is God at this time where it seems like a pandemic has taken over the world? And it's even going to affect our holy time of Purim. But we have to keep in mind that Hashem is there. And we can take the lesson from the wine and make sure we're focused by understanding that that is the focus. So that ultimately we move from Purim to Pesach, and we move from this time of God's concealment to a time of God's revealed hand, as we saw in Pesach. But it should be now, over Purim time, not that we have to wait for Pesach in order to see the miracles and experience the revelation of God's light. So I'm going to end with the story that I promised. Sorry, we're a little bit late on time. The story is about the Chidah, and the story goes, I read it many years ago, and it had such a profound impact on me that I've never forgotten it. And he settled finally in Italy for like the end of his life. And I can't remember correctly, but it seems that the people were murmuring and complaining that Mashiach tarries, that Mashiach is late, and he still hasn't come. And we should be complaining about that because we want Mashiach to come. But it seems that also the people were not necessarily behaving so well. There was a lot of lashon hara, in their speak and in their talk. And one day, a woman brought her baby to the Chidah. And her baby was very, very sick. And she gave her baby to the Chidah, to this very holy man, asking for a blessing that he should be healed. And when the Chidah took this child and he looked at it, he was absolutely taken aback. He reacted with complete shock when he looked at this child. And then he started to say the words of the Aleph Beis to the baby. He started to teach it, Aleph, Beis, Gimel. And the baby miraculously repeated the words of the Aleph Beis back to him, which was in itself a very, very strange phenomenon. And then he gave the child back to the mother. And several days later, it was told that the baby had died. And the Chidah revealed as follows, that that child, that baby, carried the neshama of Mashiach. And the generation at that time did not merit for Mashiach to be revealed. And that's why the baby died. And so we know that in every single generation, Mashiach exists. And it is us. And we are told that we have the power and we are going to be the generation that welcomes Mashiach. And so please, God, it will be this Purim, after we've experienced practically a year of this pandemic and of such strange phenomena in our lives. Let the time of the Aliyah, the time of the ascent after our descent be now. And so I'm wishing everybody a happy Purim. Please, God, will be the ultimate happiness for all of us. Thanks, ladies. Thank you all for joining me this morning. Hello, Etty. I see you there. I'm so excited. I see you there, Etty. Thank you for joining. Thank you, everybody. I'm so excited.
Why don't you show you a book?
Thank you. It's so nice to see you too, and welcome back.
I want you to show you a book. I've got so many of the details in that you mentioned, but
the golden cage.
The golden, it's called The Gilded Cage by Sarah Brownstein. And it's got an amazing information and story of Esther. It's just incredible.
It's Rabbi Ruddle's sister of Hama'or. She wrote it, yeah.
Beautiful.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Honey from Jelakit, her sister. Have you read it, Bill? I'd love to read it.
I have read it, and
yes,
it's amazing. I've never seen Esther in that light. I've never known. So yeah, it's really worth it to read. Yeah. And your share was also just amazing. Thank you so much. Shkoya.
Thank you, Brigitte.
Purim Sameach.
Thank you. Thank you. Purim Sameach, everybody. Thank you. And thanks for sharing, Roz. I must definitely try and read that book.
For a Brigitte. Ask Sarah Bronstein or someone at school. Ask a little Bronstein boy at school. That's where I got it from.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. Beautiful.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks,
Ruddle,
ladies.
Ruddle. Ask the Ruddle boy.
Yes, otherwise
he got it for me.
Yes, Ruddle, because it's his auntie. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
He's got them too. Okay. Bye. Bye.
Okay. Bye. Freilich Purim, everybody. God bless. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. How I can go out.
You too. Bye.